Week 12, and folks, early games from this point on. So some strategy comes into play as far as the injury report goes. Hey, how are you? Jason Horowitz with you on the Chase Fantasy Football Series, exclusively here on CBS Sportsline, and here to help me out via satellite from Miami, we're welcoming Jamey Eisenberg. And Jamey, heading into Week 12, this week, Thursday football games, Thanksgiving, Turkey Day, obviously goes with football. But some people, they have to set their rosters either Thursday morning. Others, they only have to decide on whether to take chances on the guys that are injured in Thursday's games. The rest they can decide on the weekend. But four guys who may or may not go as of Wednesday afternoon: Kevin Jones, Mike Bell, Tatum Bell, Tony Gonzalez. Here's where the strategy comes in. Do you sit these guys out because they may or may not play and they're coming off short weeks? Or do you start them and take the chance that, hey, maybe they'll play and they'll have a good week?
It really depends on the guy, Jason. I mean, if you're talking about Tatum Bell and Tony Gonzalez, two guys who missed games last week in preparation to play this week, maybe you roll the dice and say hopefully that they get back in there, especially with a guy like Tatum Bell. If Mike Bell's not going to play, Denver's not going to go into that game without one of those two guys, even though Damian Nash has some potential to maybe do some stuff. Kevin Jones is probably a guy you want to rest this week because it's a short week. He had the injury last week against Arizona. A high ankle sprain is never a good thing. He may miss a couple weeks, but certainly this week you want to rest him. And then with Gonzalez, again, as we mentioned, maybe you roll the dice if you don't have a better tight end, but if you can afford to put him on your bench and maybe save him for another week, that's probably the direction you want to go.
Especially if you can switch your roster later in the weekend and you have guys that you may play Sunday, you'll have that decision and you'll have some guys to switch between come Sunday of this weekend, obviously with the games on Thursday. All right, Jamey, let's get into your starts and sits, and we'll start with your stardom quarterbacks. You like Matt Hasselbeck in a game. He's supposed to come back and start against Green Bay. You like Matt Hasselbeck. You also like Tony Romo of his 19 of 23 performance. He's playing Thanksgiving Day against Tampa Bay. What about the sit-em quarterbacks? Rex Grossman, fantasy-wise, he has had a good week every other week for the last 5 weeks. And this past week, just one touchdown and 119 yards. So fantasy-wise, it's off a bad week. So he's due for a good week. You also say to sit Jake Plummer at Kansas City. Now, Jamey, I want to ask you about Rex Grossman. He's due for a good week this week. Why sit him?
I have to disagree with you there, Jason. I don't think he's due for a good week. I think, looking at last week, he did what he was supposed to do. He managed the game. He threw a touchdown, didn't throw any interceptions. When he's been bad, he's been really bad. And I think this week he's facing New England, which is coming off a shutout against the Packers, although Brett Favre missed most of that game. I still think New England, being at home, they sort of, they're going to hit that extra gear that they always do every year. And I think you're going to see they're really going to, harass Rex Grossman, blitz him a lot, force him into some turnovers, which is when he struggles, is when he gets a lot of pressure. So I think he's a guy you probably want to avoid this week simply because of the matchup.
And New England now playing with the new field turf up there at Gillette Stadium. All right, Jamey, let's get to your stardom running backs, and a guy who, well, this is a guy that I think you should start every week. Frank Gore at St. Louis off his 212-yard performance, a 49er franchise record. Meanwhile, Ronnie Brown, 2 weeks ago he had the groin injury. This past week, just 2 rushing yards against Minnesota. You have him as a start at Detroit, and Wally Lundy at the Jets, one of the worst rushing defenses in the NFL. Meanwhile, sit-em running backs. You've got Jamal Lewis against Pittsburgh, and I know during Who's Hot, Who's Not, we talked about him as being a guy who's playing much better, but the Steelers, 21 straight games without giving up a 100-yard rusher. Meanwhile, Edgerrin James, he couldn't get 100 yards against the Lions. He's not going to get 100 yards this season. If he couldn't do it against the Lions, he's also going up against Minnesota at Minnesota, the best rush defense in the NFL, and Corey Dillon against Chicago. As far as Dillon, we're talking about streaks. He has scored at least one touchdown every other week as well. He had one last week, Jamey, which means he's due to not have one this week, plus he's going up against the Bears. But let's talk about Wally Lundy. Sam Congatto got a lot of carries in the game against Buffalo. How does that affect Wally Lundy's playtime and his carries this week against the Jets?
Well, Lundy left the game a little bit because of a shoulder injury, but I think he came back. He was fine. I think he's going to be fine this week. Certainly, he's got to be salivating seeing the Jets' defense and the way that they, just let anybody run through. And I think you and I could probably start in the backfield and do a little bit of damage against the Jets. Speaking of Jamal Lewis, I know, he's been really good lately with Brian Billett calling the plays. It's really changed things for him. But I think if you look at Pittsburgh's run defense, it's 21 straight games now. They haven't allowed a 100-yard rusher. Lewis has struggled his past 2 games. He hasn't gotten 90 total yards against the Steelers the last 2 times he faced them last year. So I think Lewis is a guy, you sort of have to, go back to some of your earlier expectations of Lewis and realize that he's going to struggle this week in a tough division game.
Yeah, when we draft fantasy-wise next year, the running backs that go early are definitely going to be completely different than the ones that went early this year. All right, let's get to your stardom wide receivers. And you like Larry Fitzgerald. He's back in. He's healthy. He's at Minnesota. He's going home to Minnesota. That pass defense not as good, nearly as good as the run defense. Meanwhile, Chris Chambers at Detroit. Last time he played on Thanksgiving, 3 touchdowns. And Braylon Edwards against Cincinnati. And we talked about Edwards in roster trends and who's hot, who's not, and Edwards has been having monster weeks the last few weeks. Meanwhile, your sit-up wide receivers, Dante Stallworth, he's at Indianapolis. His status also changes depending on if Bob Sanders plays, but he's not a good sit. You also don't like Randy Moss in San Diego, and folks, and Jamey, Randy Moss doesn't like Randy Moss in San Diego. He doesn't even want to be in Oakland either. Randy Moss, Art Shell said he wants to trade him. Is he a guy that you should sit the rest of the season? The Raiders aren't going to sit him. Should you sit him?
You have to sit Randy Moss. I mean, he's been such a bust this year. Whether it's been because of the offensive line, the quarterback situation with Aaron Brooks coming out, he doesn't want to play there. I mean, it's hard to figure out what's going on in Randy Moss's head. I don't think the Raiders know what's going on in Randy Moss's head, which is why, as you mentioned, Art Shell is really considering either trading him or even releasing him next year for salary cap purposes. So I think from a fantasy perspective, you have to stay away this week, probably the rest of the season, simply because, every time you put him in, he's got one catch in the last 2 weeks. That's certainly not going to help anybody, especially as the playoffs are coming along. So Randy Moss, he's got, you could just stamp the bust tag on him and put him on your bench, maybe even release him at this point.
Let him go back to West Virginia and have his juice store that he has. Jamey, hope you have a very happy Thanksgiving. Enjoy the football. We'll see you real soon.
Same to you, Jason. I hope you have a happy Thanksgiving as well.
All right, folks, for the rest of Jamey's starts and sits, be sure to check out the articles coming from CBS Sportsline crew down in Florida. And, of course, for you, have a very happy Thanksgiving as well. That'll do it for Stardom Sit 'em here on the Chase Fantasy Football Series. Good luck in Week 12. I'm Jason Horowitz. Take care.